When I first began this series on the miracles in the New Testament, we looked at the virgin birth fairly early on because I wanted to keep some distance away from our celebration of the same event at Advent. And likewise, I have had us take a look at the resurrection, and next week, the road to Emmaus, because I want us to listen to the stories not in the framework of just the celebration of Easter, but to take a look at what's really said in each of these events that are often overlooked because we're looking at the resurrection. So the first thing we see this week is that the disciples basically say to the women, "What you say is nonsense." They had gone to the tomb early on. The men had perhaps been fearful for their lives. It was really their lives that were on the line. The women were not viewed as being anyone of any importance, so the leaders of the Jews weren't really after them. The women were not allowed to bear witness in courts. They were not allowed any full worship either in the temple or in the synagogues. They were just there, in a sense, to be servants, to be seen and not heard. And so it was very easy for the disciples to say, what you're saying is just, as one commentator has said, so much female chatter that they didn't believe it. Now I want to take this in three directions to begin with. Ways in which we are missing out our understanding that a miracle has occurred in our lives. First of all, the place of women in our society has changed in the course of the lifetime of many of us. Many colleges and universities now find more than 50% of the undergrads to be women. And we have seen many women rise in corporate structures. And sometimes there are men who really haven't caught on to this. And sometimes they're rather embarrassed as they pontificate on a subject only to discover that the woman that they're talking to knows far more about the subject than they do. One of the things we have to struggle with in life is that sometimes we underestimate the sources of what's coming to us in terms of knowledge and direction. When I was in the Covenant Church in Paxton, Illinois, I asked a woman, Darlene Carpenter, to consider being the church chair, and she was surprised that I should ask her because in the 120-year history of the church, there'd never been a woman who was church chairman. But I said to her, Darlene, you've got some background that's important. You have served on almost every one of our church boards. You've been our secretary of the executive board a number of times, and you have some life experience that has made you unique and has prepared you for this kind of thing. Darlene was a widow of a graduate of the Air Force Academy. Her first husband died while serving in the Air Force at a radar station in northern Canada. He unfortunately drowned while they were on a family outing, and that complicated things for her because she would have to make her way back to the States. She would have to deal with making sure her children were taken care of, her two boys. She would have to find a job to support them, and she had to go through all kinds of bureaucratic paperwork just to make sure she got all the benefits that she was entitled to. In many respects, this experience had made her a formidable woman and had developed a tender but determined spirit in her. And she made a great church chairman. Besides that, her second husband was a farmer. And anyone who knows anything about farming today knows that farm finances can be very, very complicated. And Darlene was doing all the bookwork for her husband. Second, don't underestimate people just because they don't have a certain education or corporate experience or financial or social status. The Besides Darlene, I've had a couple of other church chairmen who have served with distinction, who didn't fit the mold. One was Stanley Danielson in Dearborn, Michigan. He wasn't chairman while I was there, but he had been in the past. He was a retired mailman who did not have a college education, but he had been on every board in the church. He had been the deacon board chairman many times. He had been the Sunday school superintendent. And he had something about him that would allow him, even though he didn't have a lot of education, to face down some of the corporate executives in the auto companies or engineers and say, no, this is the way I feel God is calling the church to go. And then while I was in Warren, Pennsylvania, there was Walter Swanson, who served as church chair. He was a retired auto body man. Walter was not the best educated person in the church, but again, he had been a long-time deacon. He had been deacon board chairman. He had the ability to listen to people. He also knew when he didn't know something, and he would go and search out advice from people. And he also had an advantage that was very helpful. His brother-in-law, the Reverend Harry Swanson, was a longtime covenant pastor and was also serving as superintendent of the Great Lakes Conference for almost 20 years. And so with Harry up in Jamestown, New York, 20 miles away, 25 miles away, he had many resources to tap into, and he wasn't afraid to do it. We have to be careful that sometimes we underestimate the people who give us advice or seek to give godly advice. Now, I will also say, be careful who you listen to, because there's a lot of people who don't know nothing and have no spiritual depth who give you advice that they would not follow. If you're getting financial advice from someone who has bankrupted themselves several times or made very poor financial choices, they're probably not the best people to listen to. And if you're getting marital advice from someone who's been married 5 times, maybe that's not the best place to go either. But don't underestimate how God can speak to you through people in your life. Third, make sure you are training people to be leaders in the future. Excuse me. I point this out because many times parents, when their children show interest or enthusiasm about something, for example, a child saying, "Mom, Dad, look at the butterfly," and you say, "Oh, I'm too busy to look at that." Sometimes we find children's self-esteem pushed down, their initiative shoved aside because parents don't have time for them. And the same thing often happens in church ministry. Too often churches have lost potential church leaders because no one will find meaningful places for them to serve or to help to train them for the future. That's really a problem. My parents were members of a church in the Chicago area where they lost almost a whole generation of young people to another ministry simply because the old guard wouldn't make place for them. They hadn't given up their jobs. Now, many churches have rules about how many times somebody can serve in a particular position before they have to leave, some time go by. And part of that is so that there is a mix of people who learn the responsibilities, and also to make sure that no group or individual or family has too much of a stranglehold on the ministry of the church. The irony in that particular church setting was that it wasn't outsiders who were being pushed away. These were the children and grandchildren of the old guard who were leaving because there was no place for them in the ministry. Next thing, Easter says that when you are tired and your perspective is limited, beware that you don't assume the same things about life-giving experiences with the Holy Spirit moving in your life. A pastor took communion to a nursing home, and he was serving his own people, but there was a number of people who were gathered and wanted him to serve communion. And as he served, they were from many different denominations. He went to serve one woman, and she said, "What church do you serve?" And he said what church it was. And she said, well, I'm a Presbyterian, and I'm not sure I can take communion from your hand. But she did, and when she took the bread, she said, Presbyterian! And when she took the cup, she said, Presbyterian! And for that word, maybe we could substitute something like male or female, young, old, rich, poor, liberal, conservative, whatever the stumbling stones, the stones that block the moving of the Spirit in people's lives, that keep people entombed in their loss. Each of us has to take a look at our lives and saying, are we allowing something to block our access to the calling of God in our lives? Another reason the disciples responded this way to the good news was that they were in a very negative mood. The fact is that oftentimes the mood we're in colors how we respond to things. And when you're looking at things negatively, you often don't see the positive possibilities. A while back, a covenant pastor was talking to me and mentioned that their congregation, when his successor had left, was very downcast. They had called this particular pastor really in a hurry because they were afraid of having an empty pulpit, and they didn't make the best choice. And when he left, they were really down, and they started talking to the conference about possibly merging with another covenant congregation. And he said the words of the conference were, you're not ready for that. You've got hard work ahead of you. You need to look at your own church ministry. You need to look at the community in which you're serving. You need to be praying about where God might be leading to you. You need to sit down and look at resumes and see where other pastors may be coming from. You need to interview them and talk to them about things that they have done. And you might be surprised at what will jump out at you. Take note, they didn't say merger wasn't possible. They just said, you're not ready for that. You have to do the hard work. The irony is they called a pastor that they would not have normally expected to have called. Different giftedness. Also, if they had gone ahead and begun to try and call someone at that point, they would have missed out on this pastor because he was not available at that point in time. Trusting God's leading, trusting God's timing is often incredibly important. Because sometimes we rush things. We blunder ahead and do things on our own without relying on God. With the disciples, what hope they had seemed to have just disappeared. And this is how Shakespeare had Macbeth summarize life. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. But that's not the message of the gospel. Today, the Easter good news is still nonsense to many people who are entombed because they are afraid to open up their lives to God calling them. Sometimes I think the Easter message, whatever it may be in their lives, is too good to hear. An old Easter folk song says, Christ the Lord is risen from his 3-day tomb. Gone is all our sorrow, gone is all our gloom. And we have to start there. The disciples had to look at their failure. They had to look at the failure of the society in which they lived. But they had to go beyond looking at that. And just in our own lives, we may have to look at the sin in our lives, the problems we have, whatever it might be. And then we need to see where God may be calling us. Paul writes, we know that in all things God works together for the good of those who love God and who are called according to his purposes. And the psalmist writes in Psalm 130, verses 1 and 2, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. And in a sense, The message of Easter, which we often overlook, is God saying, I hear you from the depths, because I too have gone through that with my son. Easter is beyond scientific and technological explanation. It's a miracle that cries out for symbols. The egg. Look at the egg for a moment. Who would ever look at an egg and expect a chick to pop out of that, filled with all kinds of life and vitality, and begin a life? Or maybe we take a look at an Easter lily. Many of you have had experience of getting an Easter lily, and you look at the buds and they're closed. Sometimes they have to be forced for Easter simply because it's too early. But when they open up, they trumpet out a message. And even the Easter bunny. Have you ever thought about the Easter bunny? Why in the world an Easter bunny? Well, in one sense, it is very appropriate. Because for one thing, the word for hope and the word for hop come from the same root word. And it's important for us to see that the hop of the rabbit is part of the hope. Because many times our hope needs to be put into action. There are a lot of scriptures that we could put the word hop into to give us another look at it. For example, Romans 8:24, Paul says, for in hope/hop we are saved. In other words, you hope, but you have to put it into action. Or maybe from Romans 15, may the God of hope/hop fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you may abound in hope, that you might hop by the Spirit of God. Well, I could go on, but the point is that hope has to be put into action. Sometimes we have to go ahead, even though we feel like we are dragging down. We have to move forward and trust that God will be at work even in this situation. I think each of you have been through an experience in which you thought your world was coming to an end. And yet God has another stage for you. It may be that a marriage has fallen apart, that illness has come your way, that a loved one has died, that relationships have gone bad, that a job has disappeared, whatever it might be, and then there is something beyond that God says, trust me. And trust me that I can work through things that do not seem to add up or be a part of your expectation. Often in our lives, we discover that there are friends who come our way that we would not have picked, but they turn out to be very close. They're different than us, but their difference adds to who we are and adds to the relationship. And sometimes a different job makes a difference in somebody's life. Sometimes a different location makes a difference. Sometimes failure leads to great success or great joy. God says, trust me. A well-known psychologist says, hope is the radical refusal to calculate the limits of the possible. And the poet Thomas Carlyle says, every morning can be an Easter, celebrating another happy ending and a new beginning, enunciating that God loves us. Is the message of Easter nonsense to you? Is the word of the gospel too difficult for you to believe? Too unreal? It might be because you're listening to the wrong sources in life. And all you have to do is be reading things in the news, listening to news, seeing things on the news, and you can be dragged down. We live in a tough society. But the fact is that God is still at work. And he still has new and different things for us to experience, and new ways that he can be at work through us. And in that, we rejoice. Is Easter nonsense to you? Is the news too good to believe? I hope and pray that it is not. Because God indeed has great things ahead of you, if only you will trust him.